2 minutes for those of you who are eagerly awaiting the beginning of this.
Oh, really? Peterson has colors? Do you have like a mascot too?
Hi, everyone. Very delighted to welcome you here today to Princeton University. My name is Zach Verton. I'm the director here. This is the School of Public and International Affairs new center here in Washington, D.C., which we just opened last year and holding a increasing number of events, both in our space downstairs. We have a multi-purpose space there, but also in this beautiful rooftop. So we're glad you could join us. And we hope you'll become regulars here at our new space, and a warm welcome also to the many of you joining online via our live stream. I will invite you to that end. My colleague is passing out some QR codes to sign up for our mailing list if of interest. And with that, I'm going to turn us over to our dean, Amani Jamal, who could not be here today, but is going to welcome you virtually here shortly.
Thank you, Zach. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm sorry I can't be here to welcome you in person, but I'm grateful for the chance to do so virtually. I am a managing of the Prison School of Public and International Affairs. With the launch of CDC, we are forming a new collaborative relationship with many think tanks and organizations in DC. Today, the School of Public and International Affairs is delighted to join the Peterson Institute for International Economics for today's important discussion. The U.S. presidential election is just a little more than 8 months away, and the issue of globalization and the American economy is sure to be much discussed and debated. We are so fortunate to have today's discussions to offer us much needed context and analysis. My sincere thanks to panelist Helen Milner, the VC Forbes Professor of Public Affairs, Professor of Economics and International Affairs, and Director of the Greenhouse Center for Globalization and Governance at the School of Public and International Affairs, and Colin Hendricks of the Peterson Institute. And a special thanks to our moderator, Peter Orzak, one of our very own. He's alum of 1991 from economics, who is also a SPIA Advisory Council member and Advisory Board member of the Peterson Institute. I know they're going to give us much to think about. Thank you to our attendees in Washington and online. Please enjoy the discussion. Over to you, Zach.
Thanks, and thanks again to our panelists and to Peter for being with us here today. As many of you surely know, Peter is also the CEO of Lazard and a board director, and previously served in the Obama administration as director of the Office of Management and Budget. Peter, over to you.
Okay, well, welcome everyone. I think we're going to jump right into this. There's a lot to discuss. And I think just to set the scenes, our two panelists have some opening remarks that they wanted to begin with. But what I'm hoping to do is make this very interactive, so please don't be shy once we get past the beginning period to raise your hand and get involved in the discussion. Well, we hadn't actually worked out who goes first. Maybe, Helen, do you want to go first just to frame things?
Thank you. Great to see you all here. Thanks for coming. We look forward to your questions. We've decided, as Peter said, just to have brief opening statements, so I'm going to just make a couple of remarks and hopefully spur your interest in some of the topics. So what I want to argue really is that globalization is very, very important to this election. While you hear people out there saying, no, you know, they're angry people in the United States who are worried about abortion and who are worried about all these social and cultural issues, I really want to go back to, well, maybe it's the economy, stupid. The reason for that is that I think you can see in the programs that both Trump and Biden have proposed that they're in some sense responding to the deep changes that globalization has made over the past 40 years in the US. So we've had this fairly open economy that's become increasingly open to trade and foreign investment and capital flows of all sorts and labor flows over the last 40 years, as most other countries on the globe have also. This has had cumulative changes in the economy and in society in most countries over that period. What that's done in the United States through, in some sense, the pushing of deindustrialization, outsourcing, offshoring, technological change, upgrading, upskilling, has created winners and losers in this moment. And over time, that has changed the underlying sort of public preferences about globalization, as well as among other things. And so what you've seen is a migration from the Democrats of the white working class over to the kind of Republicans and Trump over time. And you've seen a migration of highly educated, more high-income voters over to the Democrats. This has been a fairly strong change in sort of voting alignments in the United States. And it's not just a change in public preferences, it's also one that's matched by changes in the positions and rhetoric of the parties. As you can see, the Republican Party on things like trade, the position has changed very dramatically. And I think this is in part to attract voters, especially these white working class voters, and to sort of maintain some of the base as well. So this has been a very fundamental change, I think, in the US economy and in its politics. I'll say more about this in questions if you ask, but let me just leave it and say, I think you can see this in the policies that Biden has pursued. He's got 4 big policy measures that went through Congress. The Investment, the Science and Chips Act, the Rescue Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the Infrastructure Act. These have all now been targeted toward areas where he's, in a sense, the Democrats have lost white working class votes, and they've been targeted, I believe, for perfectly good reasons. And you can see with Trump, he's offering an alternative program, much more isolationist, much more protectionist, and one that's very strongly aligned with what's going on in, say, the far right in Europe. These populist programs are these right populist programs are very, very sort of similar and very strong. But I think in these 2 different programs, you can see politicians appealing with different ideas to publics that have been, in a sense, shocked by globalization over the course of 30 or 40 years.
All right,
Thank
so
you.
we're going to have a lot to come back on, both on the domestic politics and on the kind of cross-country comparisons. But over to you.
Great, thank you, Peter. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon with all of you. I know the Peterson Institute values this collaboration greatly, so thank you for platforming this. 2 kind of points before we open things up for general discussion. I agree with how Helen has characterized the last 4 decades of the evolution of the partisan positions among Democrats and Republicans and the underlying changes in the preferences and attitudes of the electorate around trade. But I don't want to bury what I think is an important lead here, and that is that Americans like trade. About 3/4 say it's good for the US economy. This waned a bit during the pandemic, which was predictable and understandable. The world was a very scary place during that time, and snarled supply chains, especially for PPE, were widely reported and discussed. But at the same time, voters also favor, by about 2/3 margin here anyway, the protection of certain industries, even if that requires paying higher prices. Now, whether or not you think that willingness to pay is credible in light of the gnashing of teeth that has gone on around inflation and the real erosion of many people's purchasing power because of inflation, I guess that I'll leave it up to you to decide on that. But I think voters are particularly concerned about key strategic sectors, like semiconductors, where large majorities favor subsidizing US companies and sourcing chips from allies and quote, friendly partner countries. I think you could set up these 2 different kind of large majorities in the polling as something of a puzzle, but I don't know that I see one there. I think Americans understand that there are certain sectors that are critical, not just for the economy, but for national and human security as well. This includes bleeding edge technology like semiconductors, but also seemingly kind of innocuous items like fabric face masks that became mission critical during the pandemic. The Biden administration's small yard, high fence approach with export controls on semiconductor technologies and domestic subsidies that are associated for production of semiconductors that are associated with the CHIPS Act that Helen referenced seems kind of consistent with these sort of contrasting voter sentiments, though, one does wonder where, national security exceptions end and some sort of rent-seeking kind of begins. Now, having said that, I think that the 2024 campaign, looking ahead to the next few months, is not likely to reflect kind of the broadly pro-trade sentiment for at least two reasons. The first is that protectionist sentiment is higher in places like the Rust Belt, in Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. These were areas that were hit very hard by the relative decline of the US auto industry and the China shock several decades later, so China's emergence as a major global trader following its ascension into the WTO. And this is true even though in the case of China's ascension to the WTO, it seems as if it was potentially less due to import competition from China than it was to the effects of offshoring that Helen alluded to earlier, to the reimportation of US brands and US goods that were manufactured elsewhere. States like California and Texas, which have been very big winners from globalization, are perceived by both parties, really, and maybe this is changing a little bit with respect to Texas, as too electorally safe for Democrats and Republicans, respectively, for those voters' sentiments to really drive the campaign. So part of this just has to do with the overlap of geography of those states that we consider electorally competitive or swing states, and earlier periods of deindustrialization and major changes in the US economy. The second is that for, I think, somewhat different reasons than 2021, the world again is starting to seem like a scary place, which I think is bound to animate more trade and to a certain extent, immigration skeptic kind of sentiments. The period during which globalization really flourished was the period of the United States' hegemonic dominance in the international system, and a period of kind of historically low geopolitical risk. NAFTA, the move from GATT to the WTO, and the global loosening of capital controls are really all artifacts of the 1990s. And so with wars today in Ukraine and Gaza, increasing tensions in the Taiwan Strait, big developments recently in the remilitarization of space, and more active civil conflicts around the world than any time since the breakup of the Soviet Union, I think we're seeing something of a return to kind of Cold War levels of geopolitical risk. But unlike during the Cold War, the major economies like the United States and China and the European Union are all operating in a highly globalized, integrated world economy. So to the extent that foreign affairs are a big part of the campaign and a big part of the election, it's hard to see these active conflicts not becoming a much bigger issue than trade issues per se, although it's becoming harder than ever, I think, to cleanly separate economic and security policy. And so if you take those polling numbers I alluded to at the outset seriously, to me they suggest that many voters in the United States may actually long for a return to pre-globalization trade patterns and partners. But I'll conclude by saying I don't know if most voters and consumers are aware of how hard and how costly it would be to attempt to fully turn back the clock. So lots to talk about. Yep. Pleasure to be here.
Perfect. Thanks. All right. So what I'd like to do is I'm going to do a little bit of a fireside chat and then open it up if that's okay. But if we could kind of, there's a lot in those opening remarks, but let's maybe organize this as follows. So first, how much backlash against globalization, just existence, how much has occurred? And then a little bit on the causes, and then a bit on the effects and the consequences. So just to start on the facts about how much backlash there is or isn't, one of the things I found interesting about some of the work around the Princeton Center is how much of what we're reading about now is the elites waking up to, and the media waking up to, the way the population has often felt, and how much is the population actually changing. We also need to weave in the 75% support, so like how much opposition is there actually among the population? A, and B, how does that vary across countries, and what can we learn from the kind of cross-country evidence? So maybe, Helen, if we start with you, how, in your opinion, have the views of the underlying population, as opposed to how much we read about it, actually changed in the U.S. relative to other countries, and what can we learn from that?
So I guess I think there's been a fairly substantial change in population attitudes. So, I mean, there are these areas that really did get hit, and it's when you take data at a very fine-grained level that you see in particular places where you see the movement of say, white, working-class voters out of the Democratic Party. If you look overall at these national polls, you probably don't see as much because you see some groups moving kind of more toward the pro-globalization and other groups not. And what the economists have shown is that it is in these particular areas that got hit by, imports from low-wage countries that really, really suffered, and their whole kind of region suffered. But if you look overall at the United States, globalization has been a net positive for the U.S. economy over the past 30 or 40 years, as it has been for the European economies and most other economies. So if you look globally, you see one thing. If you look at different sort of parts of things, you see a different sort of pattern. And the problem, as we were discussing earlier, is not the problem, but the issue is that the election is going to be decided in particular places, not in the entire U.S. economy. And so that's, and many of those places are the ones that kind of, the Michigans, the Illinois, the Pennsylvanias, the Arizonas, kind of, those have been the places that have been hit a lot by, these problems in trade and things like this. So I think it's, it's a picture at sort of the micro versus the macro level. The other thing I would say is that you need elites, in a sense, to kind of offer policy packages and stir up parts of the public, right? It may not be that some of these voters would be protectionist unless you had a Donald Trump out there saying you need to be protectionist. And you have a charismatic figure out there saying those things, and I think that is also important. And you see that in Europe. You see, Meloni, you see Le Pen now even, I mean, in these different countries, elites pushing policy packages like protectionism, isolationism, more pro-Russia than we've been, that we wouldn't think that anybody would be pushing, but they are. And they're having an appeal, and the question is how many voters are they going to sway?
So just, we're going to come back to some of the causes and how much has been the China shock and trade versus technology, et cetera, in a second. But on the question of France, Germany, et cetera, and I understand the point that there's a huge amount of variation within a country, but on average, in Europe, do you think the views on globalization are materially different in the US, or the mean difference between the US and Europe is so small that the internal variation is what we really should focus on, even in France, even in Germany?
The Europeans are much more trade dependent than we are. So I think for them, they've always known that trade is important, and the smaller the country in Europe, the more they're focused on trade. The problem for the Europeans right now is China. And it's their solar industry, it's their auto industry, it's machine tools, it's all the, the strong points of European industry, and the Chinese are, eating their lunch, frankly, right now. And so I think the Europeans have a big problem here because they want to be free traders, they need trade, but they've got the Chinese pushing them very, very hard. And I think that means that trade, they're sort of more in favor of trade, but more scared of trade right now.
So comments on the trends and existence. Maybe one question is your 75% statistic, what was that 20 years ago?
Well, so it's waxed and waned a little bit. It I think hit sort of a local minimum in the run-up to the Trump election. But during Trump's presidency in 2019, it sort of hit among the highest values it's ever had in terms of Americans agreeing with the statement that trade overall is good for the U.S. economy. And I think that, as Helen already pointed out, trade is overall good for the U.S. economy. The question is, what do we do for those particular regions and workers for whom trade has not been effective?
So can I just peel that for a second? Because so the share of the American population that says trade is good for the economy hit an all-time high under Trump.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you reconcile that with Trump every
Yeah.
vibe he gives off is, eh. So in terms of the elite messaging,
If you ask them, is trade good for you and your family? The numbers are totally different. They're much, much lower, and they're either I don't know or
Okay.
not. So it's, you've got this sociotropic view that trade may be good for the whole economy, but is
not for
trade
me.
good for you? It's the same thing when you're polling right now about is the U.S. economy in a good place? And people say, yeah, it's in a great for me, but it's in a bad place overall. I mean, it's this weird disconnect between the kind of macro picture and the micro picture.
I mean, and another part of this that I think is important is, we can take these kind of poll responses as an expression of true preferences that are durable over time, or we could imagine that people's responses to polling on these kind of questions are related to their attitudes about the administration for reasons that might not have a whole lot to do with trade. And I think that's an important part of the story, because a third reason, if we're going to eat up more time at the outset of our discussion, why you're not going to hear as much, or why it's not playing a bigger role in the US election, I think, is that there has been in this era that we're in currently of hyper-partisanship, so by various measures, the United States' partisan identifications are stronger and more entrenched than they've been at any point since the US Civil War. Under those circumstances, that's kind of, I think, had two effects. One of them is sort of well established in the literature now. The other one is a little bit more perspective. The one that's well established is the emergence of a separate kind of axis of contestation among the parties, that you're seeing less of this traditional kind of push-pull around trade policy and liberal and conservative positions on the economic axis, and then more on the social axis. So if you think that voters are weighting these kind of ascriptive identity-based sort of claims or issues like abortion more than they would have in the past, it's possible, and to me it's at least plausible, that voters are beginning to interpret information or are interpreting informational cues that they get from the economy much more through the whatever colored glasses they're wearing that are a result of these deeply held partisan identifications. And that's something of a scary prospect, because it suggests that because of hyperpartisanship, it's going to be very difficult to really get the pulse of what Americans
yeah, and the
think
most
about the
extreme
economy.
version of this is if you look at least one of the leading consumer sentiment indices, right around the election, within 2 months, you just see this massive reversal of is the economy good or bad that depends very much on party affiliation.
Right.
Making your point. Let's go to some of the causes, because I think part of the question becomes how much of this, at least in the U.S., is focused in the white male in particular population, where for 2/3 of the population, life expectancy is flat to down over the past 2 to 3 decades. There's a lot of perspective that institutions are not delivering, and a lot of frustration. And as Angus Deaton and Ann Case have written about, deaths of despair that presumably only have a little bit to do with trade. But let's start with how much of it is focused. We already highlighted that it's focused regionally to some degree, but how much of it is also focused racially and by gender? And is there something that's going on about kind of self-perceived position in the world that is feeding into views on globalization?
I mean, I think you have to recognize that technological change is part of globalization, and it's accelerated by globalization. Most countries don't innovate, they simply adopt what technologies are out there. The US is an innovator, but again, by having the economy open and enormous competitive pressures, you're kind of always trying to be on the forefront of technological change, right? And technological change, I think, that economists are finding more and more is one of the big drivers of change in the US economy. And we've got more coming, right? With AI and with automation and the combination of AI and automation, who knows what's going to happen? Everybody's kind of fighting over this these days. So I think that has made an enormous difference and has had an enormous impact. But again, one of the big impacts it's had has been on manufacturing, right? And on labor in manufacturing. Manufacturing as a percentage of value added has not really changed in the United States or much in Europe. It's manufacturing, number of workers in manufacturing has changed dramatically and gone way, way down. And again, that's automation, and who knows what AI is going to do to that. And in manufacturing, what you had were these areas, right, where you had these concentration of industries, and they were often, the white working class had great jobs in those places. And those have been some of the places that have been hit the hardest. And so it's been outsourcing, it's been offshoring, it's been moving down to the south that's non-union, and it's all the combination of those types of things along with automation that have really changed the lives of these particular cities, regions, and areas in the United States and in European countries. So I think you're seeing a big sort of cumulative movement through trade and foreign investment and technological change that is really upending sort of, you know, social and political life in many ways. And it's going to go it's ongoing.
Right.
Okay, so I'll talk in just a second about this question about sort of the working class white males. Yeah. Just on the tech change point, this is important because there's some interesting political science research that suggests that one of the things that we're seeing in terms of seemingly an increase in sort of xenophobic attitudes is that there's a fundamental misattribution among poll respondents and voters about the sources of job losses. So if you lose your job to automation, or for whatever reason psychologically that seems to be related, you can lose your job for automation, or you can lose your job because it's gone to Mexico or China. Mentally, it seems to have a much larger impact on people, the idea of that job being relocated and being performed by another individual, that fundamentally just hits different than does job loss to technological change. So to a certain extent, some of the backlash against trade and outsourcing and offshoring, I think it's getting a little bit of the bill that's coming due for these changes.
Can I ask you just about misallocating before you go on to the next point? The other thing that's always struck me is most of the political debate about trade is about trade agreements. You know, should we have opened up? Should, you know, China join the WTO? Should NAFTA have happened? It always struck me that more of the dynamics in trade had to do with, I mean, container shipping, I think, arguably has done as much to drive international trade over the past 3 or 4 decades as all of the agreements got put together. Mm-hmm. So is there any disconnect that you see in terms of the terms of the debate, like where even if it's misplaced relative to technology, and I understand the point that you can't really separate them, is there also a kind of misplaced debate about where the anxiety comes out? Or not?
You know, I don't know. I mean, I think that very few people in the room, I presume, are Luddites. I don't consider myself one. I don't think that there are many people in the U.S. economy who want to kind of roll back the clock on technology, because technology, broadly speaking, has brought a lot of benefits. And so for that, I can't think of any better way to put it than I think that people are used to technological change being a constant in their lives, and it may be more extreme during certain periods than others. I think that technological change was co-occurring during, you know, I mean, it's like the China shock was working its way through the U.S. economy during the global financial crisis, which is one of the reasons why I think it took the global financial crisis kind of receding for people to start realizing the effect that something like the China shock had had. Technological change seems to me to be something, I mean, we hear a lot about it, but it seems to me to be something that people kind of have going on in the background. Just on your question about kind of white males, so maybe this is why I'm on the panel. I mean, I grew up in a small town in West Michigan that had one of the largest employers there was General Motors, had a body stamping plant. I worked at a truck factory in Kalamazoo, Michigan, actually Oshtemo Township, and I know a lot of these guys. I worked with these guys. These guys were making a good income with a high school education and supporting a family of 4. Or I mean, if we lost 6,000 jobs, you know, dispersed throughout the DC area tomorrow, it might be a big deal, but it would certainly be a big deal if all 6,000 of those were coming from a single firm or employer. And I think that these communities, to a certain extent, have, especially in places that experience this earlier import competition and deindustrialization, I think there are some lasting kind of psychological effects and psychological scars there.
I was going to turn to some of the effects, but why don't we actually, I'd like to turn it to open it up to the audience, and if no one is forthcoming, I'll turn to the effects. Thank you very much. Yeah, I don't know, microphones, or are we going to, we are doing microphones. Let's start here, and then we'll go to that with Jacqueline. My only request is please ask a question and don't make a statement.
Okay. There needs to be a little bit of a context, though, which is I'd like some more discussion explicitly about worsening inequality related to globalization, and in particular related to the various policies about globalization. With regard to the trade agreements and the WTO and so on, the promise was always, and we all know about this from Princeton, the winners can compensate the losers. There were all these promises about trade adjustment assistance. And, that's really seemed to just fall apart. So there was a real loss of trust, I think, in, so many of these working families and so on. And this is now, I'm afraid, starting to repeat itself with regard to, what should we do about, climate policy? Well, let's just raise the, let's have a carbon tax. And, this is, then they say, oh, but we'll figure out some way for the winners to compensate the losers. And, why would anyone believe that? So this is what I would like to talk about.
So can you maybe take that question and use some of the cross-country comparisons? Because European countries in general have, at least over the period of time that we're, where many of these effects were developing, had much more extensive social insurance schemes and assistance that were provided to people, which is why one of the reasons why I was curious about the views on globalization. So how much, I guess two questions. One is, what can we learn from the European experience? That's point one. And part two is, how much is the kind of Econ 101 thing, or the intro econ, you just compensate the losers through trade adjustment? How much is that actually right? In other words, coming back to your psychological point, if someone in Mexico, quote, took your job, but you have the opportunity to retrain for a job that's, lower paying, how much better do you actually feel about that? But why don't we start with Europe, and then, anything to add on what the effect of the absence of a very robust TAA is?
So let me say something about inequality. Again, inequality is associated with globalization, but I think the economists are finding more and more that it's the skill-biased technological change that has really driven this. And of course, that means it's driven it across the advanced industrial countries, not just the United States. And you've seen rising inequality in all of those countries, not as much as in the US and Britain, but you've seen it. And again, this technological, the skill bias is accelerated then by trade and foreign investment and these kinds of things. So again, it's a package of related things. We have a long literature that says, governments can compensate for all of these things, for technological change as well. They can slow things down, they can sort of redistribute. The problem is, and it's not just a problem here, it's again an issue in Europe, is welfare states in Europe surprisingly really haven't decreased in terms of like per capita spending on social welfare, but they haven't increased. And so the problem has been they've been hit harder and harder by trade and foreign investment and these kinds of things and global economic shocks, and the welfare state hasn't responded. And this is true in the United States too, where it really hasn't responded either. The other thing that's been happening is not only that the government hasn't responded, it's that publics don't seem to be responding anymore. If compensation once worked to kind of palliate anger and disappointment with the system, it's not working anymore. I mean, I've run a bunch of numbers on these things, and what you can just see is that in areas that are hit by the China shock, but that get more sort of social welfare spending in Europe, they're just as likely to respond by voting far right as areas that don't have that kind of social compensation. So for some reason, I think this social welfare is not working the way it used to work. And this may be related to some of the psychological things that you're talking about, where people would rather have a good job than to be paid money by the government to not work or to even to retrain. And there seems to be a lot of resistance to this kind of intervention.
Yeah. Helen, you ended up right where I was going to go with that. I mean, I'm not a psychologist, so I can't answer this question from a position of expertise, but it seems to me reasonable that people are going to value a dollar earned very differently from a dollar given, or especially as compensation for job loss. If we go back to talking about that specific segment of the U.S. workforce, we're talking about individuals who I think we're used to being able to take pride in being able to support a nuclear family on their income. Now, you might be able to replace that partially with trade adjustment assistance, assuming that you can prove that your job was lost due to a plant closure and you can prove that the plant was reopened somewhere else, right? So if you think about that occurring concurrently with the technological change that's going on, the attribution problems, I think, become very large for the individuals, but they also become, I think, a significant problem for people who are trying to institute these kind of policies. And I think Helen's already alluded to this, but most of the countries in Europe that we're talking about, they entered the 1990s, or actually they in the 1960s, they were much more trade exposed than the United States has been until very, very, very recently, if not more. And they've had kind of welfare states, and they may not be working as well as they did, but they did work, I think, reasonably well for a long time. In no small part because in many of those European countries, the leaders were having their feet held to the fire by active communist movements and communist parties, which is not something that we saw emerge in the United States. So part of it has to do with our electoral system.
Strong unions. Yeah,
strong unions. Yeah, and then another piece of this, which I think is important, is the the historical legacy of slavery and the degree to which I think public assistance and the reticence to have a much broader program, safety net, and much broader program of transfers to deal with these kinds of dislocations in the economy is rooted in very racialized attitudes about who receives welfare and what welfare is for. And I think that that's doing great damage to our national psyche, to say nothing of our national character.
All right, I'm going to interrupt for a second. We're going to go here and then back there. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Sean Donnan from Bloomberg News. I'm struck by the fact that this is a discussion much like the ones that we were having in 2016, right, about the backlash and the sources of the backlash. And at the same time, we've now had two presidents and two rounds of kind of policy response, if you will, the tariffs and the protectionism of Donald Trump, and Biden and his embrace of industrial policy while leaving in place some of the tariffs of Donald Trump. We also, as a kind of background, I think I'm right in saying there are more people employed in manufacturing today than there were 5 years ago in the United States, although as a percentage of the population that perhaps hasn't moved very much. I'm just curious to hear who got it right in terms of the presidents so far, whether we've seen a real meaningful change in the well-being of these left behind communities. I think David Otter and co. in a recent study pointed out that the tariffs under Donald Trump had yielded more votes than jobs in these areas. So I'm just kind of curious to, what do we know now about these left behind places, and who got the policy response right, since we've got two presidents who are going to be running against each other in November, who each have had their own response.
Yeah, and maybe to sort of broaden the question a little bit, which is an excellent question, is we just heard that maybe the investment assistance doesn't really solve things that much, or welfare programs don't solve things that much. And we can't, world, you can't turn off technology, you can't turn off trade. So there's one question, which is, what Trump and Biden have tried to do. There's another question, which is there anything that would work? Is there any pathway forward that would get at this underlying anxiety in the face of both technology and trade that you find credible?
I mean, I think the question is still open, and this is what I was proposing, is that Trump and Biden are running on two different programs about how to solve this problem. Trump's program is more protectionist, it's more isolationist, And Biden's is a bit more open, certainly less isolationist, work with allies, try and build sort of networks, trade networks and investment networks with allies. And I don't think we know which of those is going to work. I mean, the economists and the sort of political economists who look at history say that protectionism really has not worked very well over time. It slows an economy down, it makes it less productive, less efficient, there's a lot of waste. It's a worry. On the other hand, we've seen China pumping enormous subsidies into these industries and them doing quite well, so there's a worry that you're kind of missing the boat. I think Biden has moved away from the government compensation type of stuff, and I think that's what the Infrastructure Act was about, the Science and Chips Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act. He's not trying to just hand money over to people. He's trying to, promote sort of green industries and new industries, and then the, semiconductors and the whole sort of global value chain of semiconductors, and hoping that in that you provide jobs. Higher, they're going to be higher skilled jobs, that you provide jobs for people in these areas again that allow them to have a good living. Whether that's going to work or not, it's not a short term, it's not like it's going to, 2 years is going to turn things around. I mean, you've had 30 or 40 years of globalization kind of massively shifting the economy over time. And, this economy is big and it's slow moving, so.
What's the answer?
Oh, gosh. No, I think, maybe this doesn't make for riveting viewing, but I actually agree with Helen largely with respect to both the distinctions that you've drawn, and then I think it relates to some of the things that we were talking about earlier, because if you think that the United States is not going to, in some proximate future, have a robust European-style welfare state, and I would bet that it probably won't, then some form of protectionism and sort of infant industry or industrial policy is a kind of a second best sort of solution to try to provide some, address some of these issues related to employment. And this has kind of broader, I think, effects, especially with the CHIPS Act for national security as well. So that the industries that have been targeted, I think, for the, most specifically by the CHIPS Act and then in the Inflation Reduction Act, are these emerging sectors where, China, large economic competitor, security competitor, has significant kind of first mover advantages, is responsible for an overwhelming global share of output in these industries. And what we're seeing here is an attempt to move the needle back in the other direction by the erection of barriers, and then also by the incentives that have been created by that legislation. I hope that answered the question. I mean, I think that the second approach is closer to right than the first approach, because the first approach, I think, was largely put tariffs in place, anticipate the retaliatory tariffs. Once the retaliatory tariffs are put in, find sector or geographically kind of specific mechanisms that you can use to compensate the people who are hit on the back end, and turn that into a mechanism for generating political support. Now, you could argue industrial policy does the same thing, but industrial policy is, at least in theory, attempting to enlarge the pie that is being created, as opposed to the other one, which I think is a little bit more geared towards reducing the overall size.
Let's go to the back, and then we'll come up to the front.
Hi, Lucas Renifo-Keller of the Peterson Institute. So I'm touching again on the politics of redistribution with the fear of beating this horse to death. We're accepting maybe this premise that a dollar earned is better than a dollar given, at least politically. And I'm curious to know if there's any cross-country evidence on maybe different types of support that are more conducive to maintaining support for globalization, maybe active labor market policies instead of straight up welfare or trade adjustment assistance, maybe things that boost pre-distribution earnings rather than post-distribution earnings. If you have any thoughts on that, that'd be really interesting.
So any place that's getting this right. I mean, for a while, the hot thing was flex security, and I mean, there have been all these different, moments where people said, this is the way to kind of, walk this line successfully. Maybe, Helen, anything that you would highlight as, here's a country that's doing this really well, and what are they getting right?
Yeah. I mean, I guess it's pretty tough. I mean, I think that what's optimal for governments is to experiment with things. And I think it's to try lots of different things. And I think it's to try lots of different things, not just at the national level, but at local levels. And to try and actually assess whether those things are working or not. And not just kind of working politically, perhaps, but really sort of working economically. And, you know, part of it depends on the demands that are being made. I mean, right now, the farmers in Europe, right, are up in arms, and they're demanding, you know, price levels that you know, that you sort of keep them, you know, you tell them a liter of milk is going to, they're going to be paid so much for it, and there's going to be no going underneath that and things like that. I mean, you know, there are all sorts of different demands that different sectors want, and it's not clear sort of which of those are going to work and which of those are not going to work. And so I think that experimentation is probably the best thing. The U.S. has tried with the you know, job training, and that often has not worked. I think some of the data on that just shows that people don't get the jobs that they need, in part because they're not moving to the places where the jobs are. That's been another thing, that in both Europe and the United States, mobility has gone way down, and that's a real problem. I mean, you know, economic theory says everybody's sort of, you know, costlessly mobile. We know that's not true, but if nobody's mobile at all, then the economy looks really, really different than anything that the economists have written down.
Okay, we'll go over here.
Sure. Frank Langford with NPR. You talked about the Inflation Reduction Act, the Infrastructure Act, and some of that being pointed towards swing states and Rust Belt states. Is President Biden getting political credit for that? And if not, why not?
Yeah, I mean, you know, things that I read just suggest that states like Texas and, you know, states in the South are the ones that are the primary beneficiaries now from a lot of these policies. I think the question is, will he benefit in the election? I think with looking at public opinion polls this far out is not probably an optimal thing to do. You're not seeing him benefiting, I think, in those polls. Will he at the end of the day? You know, I don't know. Again, the question is whether that package is an appealing package versus kind of the Trump protectionist, isolationist package. And I think people are being asked to vote on those two packages, and that's becoming more and more the standard kind of thing that people are being asked to vote on in Europe and the United States.
You know, I think that to that list, I would also add Arizona. So Arizona has been the largest beneficiary by orders of magnitude from investments that have been announced posterior to the CHIPS Act. And you know, the electoral geography or electoral calculus that's going on underneath this is, I mean, part of it, I think, is good politics and good political strategy, but a lot of this is just, it's a function of where the remaining domestic supply chains, domestic places of production for auto vehicles with respect to the IRA were located. Same with the semiconductor industry out west. And we're talking about real money here. I mean, we're talking about, you know, $250 billion worth or more of announced investments coming out of the IRA and the CHIPS Act. Now, is this going to, you know, flip deep red states or deep red parts of states where some of these, you know, for instance, battery manufacturing facilities are going into? Probably not, but it doesn't have to for this to be electorally successful, right? So if it just can shave off a little bit of support for, say, the Republicans in rural areas where these, and semi-rural, you know, peri-urban areas where these kind of plants are going in, it reduces the pressure to really do the kind of turnout mobilization game in urban areas where Democrats are traditionally stronger. So now, will that come to pass? I don't know, because you know, part of me is skeptical because I do think there is something to the idea that that people still care about the economy, but the economy is changing fewer and fewer people's mind. You can all do this experiment when you're walking around today. I mean, if you know people in your orbit who are particular to one candidate or the other, or supporters of Trump, ask them if they're likely to switch their vote. Or ask Biden supporters or Democrats under what economic circumstances they would support Trump. I think that the answers might be surprising because I think that, you know, it's possible that there aren't going to be many of them.
Let's so here, the only one other thing I'd add is the politics of the distribution should not be thought only of with regard to the election. It's also with regard to the durability of the legislation should the parties flip. And that's a different calculus. In other words, Texas, Biden administration may hope that Texas is a swing state. It's not. So, but when there's a legislative battle, or if there's a legislative battle over repealing, culling back, or what have you, that's a different calculus.
Barry Wood, RTHK in Hong Kong. We're at least 3 from West Michigan here. I remember when that GM plant opened in Kalamazoo, and that was the late 60s. It's tragic that it closes now, but we can't ignore the fact that auto investment is pouring into Georgia and South Carolina. Volvo is in Charleston, Hyundai is in Georgia, anyway. So there is that. It's a huge, sad thing for Michigan. My question is, what about Mexico? It's now become the biggest exporter into the U.S. market, passing China. Do you think that's going to continue, whereas China, once trade becomes normalized, surge again?
I mean, one thing to remember about the quote-unquote China shock is that something like 60% of Chinese exports at the time were, in effect, re-exports of American and European multinationals. They were part of the global value chain. They weren't the Chinese multinationals in 2002. That wasn't, that wasn't going on. And this is the same thing that you're seeing in Mexico. A lot of these are American multinationals and European multinationals with either moving their global value chains or increasing the production out of Mexico, or or the Chinese moving through Mexico. So I think you're going to see that continue and probably accelerate as it was, in the original part of NAFTA. So I don't think I see that sort of ending. But you never know. Trump may decide that he wants to put on, as he said, 10% tariffs or more from every country in the world on every product, which would have big effects.
Yeah, just on that point, I mean, I think that this is actually a point that draws a pretty sharp contrast between Trump and Biden's approaches, because as you alluded to, the tax credits that have been unlocked by the IRA for manufacturing, for electric vehicle manufacturing, are not just available to U.S. automakers, right? These are some of the biggest adopters, right? Have been foreign firms that they're choosing to locate here. In this sense, you could make the argument that policy is more pro-U.S. worker than it is pro-U.S. business. Although I don't know how far I would push that, but I do think that that's important. And I think that the question about Mexico, I think I'm not sure I have a good answer for you yet, but I have been thinking about that a lot because in the same way that BYD is moving into Hungary to get access to the European market, you have BYD moving into Mexico with the eventual, I assume the eventual hope is that they're going to be exporting into the US market. And that's going to create, I think, significant challenges, because if you think that the competition is fierce on price in EVs now, wait till you see what BYD can produce for about half the cost.
All right, we're going to take the last question back there.
Yeah. Christopher Williams, I'm retired from long service at CBO. You acknowledged, I think, right up front, and I was pleased to hear that the US is a relatively closed economy compared with Europe, at least. Listening to this, it makes me feel like if there's a need for political action or the theater of perceived action to attend to people's concerns, is our system one where it's relatively safe, relatively less costly to play with protection than it is to affect technology and capital location and free markets in the rest of the economy? It would cost us, we know that, but perhaps less than other things we might do to try and propitiate or win elections or make people feel better, especially given that we have doubts about how any of these policies might actually work out.
Okay, so if there is no real solution, but we have to be caught trying, is it better to be caught trying on tariffs given the size of the domestic market here, and so maybe it doesn't harm things that much?
I mean, I would say in two ways it may not be a good idea. One is that I think politicians, political leaders all over are caught between these demands for, sort of subsidies and protection and consumer prices. And protection in the United States at some 10% level or more is going to have has been shown to have a big effect on prices. So that's not going to make people happy. You saw, what the inflation sort of ramp from 2 years has done in the US and in other places. So I think that's not going to make people happy. The other thing is protection is going to adversely affect the big American firms because their global value chains are going to come under severe pressure. And it's going to affect capital investment. It's not at all clear that you protect the United States and all these firms start investing in the United States. That to me doesn't seem to be clear. Plus it's probably going to slow up because it'll slow up competitive pressures. It'll slow up technological change in the US. So, or anywhere that does this. We have, pretty good data on that too. So I think in the long run, the protectionist answer is going to be a difficult one, both politically and economically, even for an economy that's not as globalized as most of the other world's economies.
I mean, well said. The only thing I would add to that too is that I think if you're a small open economy somewhere in the world and you decide to play with fire, so to speak, that may have relatively limited implications. We're talking about the world's largest, most dynamic economy. What the United States chooses to do in the way that it orients itself towards the rest of the world matters greatly in terms of a demonstration effect, I think, so that we're actively creating the world that we're going to have to live in with these kinds of policies, not just in terms of the effects it'll have for industry in Georgia, but in terms of the ways in which our trade partners, our allies, these friendly nations I was alluding to earlier, the kinds of policy responses that they are going to enact. And if you buy the point I was making earlier that we are entering a period of heightened geopolitical risk, the United States is going to need friends.
Well, one of my favorite sayings from one of my Princeton professors was, it's often necessary to become completely confused before really understanding something. And I often wondered, do you always get to the end state there, or do you just stay in the confused part? But I do hope that, first I want to thank Princeton and the Peterson Institute, and especially our two panelists for trenchant and insightful commentary on a really difficult set of questions. So thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks. No problem.
I'm Frank. I'm with National Public Radio.
Awesome.
I cover labor. Wonderful.